Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Coffee with Her. We're on episode 19, and this one's going to be a pretty quick episode. But in this episode, we're going to be talking about praise or compliments in a professional setting, and we're going to talk about how they can actually help foresee the type of experience that we're going to have. So, with that said, grab some tea or some coffee, and let's get started. So, we all love being praised for our work, right? But what if I told you that praise isn't necessarily always such a good thing? Sometimes just a simple compliment can cost you more than you'd think. And I actually learned this the hard way when I was working just a part time job in high school. And, it felt good to get praised at first, but little did I know that it was actually putting a target on my back. So here's the story. At some point in high school, I got a part time job at a banquet hall, okay? And one day I was working my shift and I finished my shift and I go to the office to return something. And this office isn't necessarily like a private place for people to have like confidential conversations because there was a certain people just working there preparing for another event and then there was a manager talking to another employee there. And as soon as I enter the room, the manager notices me and he says, "Hey, Mubina, do you want to work a shift on this date?" And I say, "Yeah, of course, I'd love to." And little did I know that the employee talking to the manager at that point actually requested the same shift that he just gave me. And not only that, but the other people in the room also heard the conversation that just occurred. And although the intention was good behind that, it actually caused the other coworkers to really dislike me. And it wasn't actually only a bunch of students my age working there. There was actually even some parents of those students working there as supervisors. And after overhearing that conversation, they really tried to make my experience in that workplace a living hell. Luckily, I actually got promoted not long after, where I was kind of untouchable, but at the same time, there was still a lot of shade being thrown at me. And the moral of the story is that, sometimes getting praised isn't actually necessarily good, right? Because although the manager meant well by praising me and giving me another shift, it actually caused a lot of hate from my coworkers, right? So, how do we really ensure that we know if it's all right to praise somebody in front of other people? Because obviously, when you praise somebody, you do it out of good intentions for the most part, right? But sometimes it can actually do more harm than good. And of course, it's still necessary to actually praise people. But something to keep in mind when you're praising people is, first of all, you really need to understand the workplace dynamics and you really need to use some emotional intelligence, right? Because, for example, if there's a bunch of new hires that enter a workplace and you really like the performance of one of them, you have to think about if you praise that one person in front of everybody else, will it cause people forming cliques or something like that in the workplace? And will it result in a toxic environment for that one person? Or will it be okay? Something else we can actually consider when receiving praise or compliments is the compliment hollow or is it actually enriching and respectable? Because not all praise is actually equal, right? Like, have you ever received a compliment and then questioned the real meaning behind it? Here's the story. So, when I initially pitched my idea to a potential investor, he says, "Why didn't we think of that?" And you might see this as a compliment because it means that, oh, I came up with such a unique idea that they weren't able to come up with. But alternatively, it could also mean that they wish to come up with this idea such that I would no longer be in the picture, right? And of course, judging if it's a compliment or if it's actually something else has a lot to do with emotional intelligence and intuition, right? And when I used both of those together, I realized that it was actually the latter. And based on that, I was able to understand what boundaries to have up and how to position myself in future interactions. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because a lot of times, say I were to tell somebody about this, they would normally say, well, either the glass is half empty or half full. And the reason I don't really resonate with looking at all situations as half empty or half full is because if we're constantly looking and only accepting half of what we can get, then we're kind of settling for less and accepting lower standards, right? And if we're constantly accepting lower standards, brushing off poor, low frequency behavior, then the workplace environment will never really change, right? It will always have some toxicity because people are settling for less, so other people are going to constantly try to control and be pushovers. And something as small as the type of quote unquote compliments you receive actually make a big difference, right? For example, how would you feel if you're performing a task and your manager comes up to you and says, "This is why we keep you here"? It could feel like a good thing when somebody says that to you because it could feel like they're appreciating your performance, right? But depending on how they say it, it could also mean that your worth is tied to a specific task It could feel transactional, and it could also mean that there's really no growth potential because you're only valued for that specific task, right? And all of that can really be determined when you use your emotional intelligence and your intuition. And if you see it as a hollow compliment, then you're probably right that it is. And you don't always actually necessarily have to fall into the programming where you're told to look at the glass half full or look at the bright side, Because it's actually time we start normalizing desiring a full glass and it being okay to desire a full glass, right? Not needing to settle for less all the time. And as more and more people begin to raise their standards and start believing that they deserve better, what happens is that it could even enable workplaces to do better and have a better work culture, right? So the next time you're receiving a praise or perhaps you're getting a praise, use your emotional intelligence to determine if it's the aligned thing to do and go from there. And that's all for today, folks. Until next time.
This program is meant for entertainment purposes only. It is not meant to replace any educational programs or represent a professional coaching program. All examples provided by the author and speaker are purely anecdotal and are not meant to represent any institutions or companies in affiliation with the creator.